Article 103, paragraph 4 of the Greek Constitution reads, "Civil servants holding posts provided by law shall be permanent so long as these posts exist." The wording of the clause is rather clear. It says that no one may remove a civil servant that holds a post prescribed by law. However, if the law abolishes the post, then the civil servant is not constitutionally protected anymore, and he may be removed. That is what the constitutional text says, the wording of the provision. Constitutional history, the reality of the Constitution, tells us a slightly different story. In politically troubled times, civil servants in Greece, as we know, were very often removed despite the permanency clause, which is a century old. But after 1974 and until recently, any time that a public organization or a public service would be abolished, the government always, with no exception, always took care to settle those holding the abolished posts by transferring them somewhere else in the civil service. Thus, a constitutional practice has been formed that expanded the permanency clause protection. The practice says something like that. Civil servants shall be permanent so long as their posts exist. However, even when their posts are abolished, they still have an expectation that they are not removed from civil service. So, the executive and the legislature provided civil servants with more protection than that required by the wording of the Constitution. Why did that happen? After 1974, parliamentary democracy has been functioning in a relatively satisfactory way, well, at least in relation to previous times. The people generally could choose more or less freely their representatives, the politicians, and no politician that wants to be re-elected would choose to remove civil servants if she could find another solution to keep them in civil service. Dictators could freely remove people. They didn't have to worry about elections. But in democracy, politicians are answerable for their actions to the electorate. So, the answer to the question, why did that happen, lies in what recently very often is denounced as the political cost. Politicians generally do not wish to make unpopular decisions because those could possibly cost them their re-election. Is that a bad thing? It depends. If, for instance, politicians decide to oppress a minority because that is what most people want, then yes, that is a very bad thing. However, that is also unconstitutional, a political choice not permitted by the Constitution. On the contrary, retaining civil servants after their posts are abolished is not an unconstitutional option. It provides greater, not lesser, protection than that required by the Constitution. So, when among more permissible options, politicians choose the one that the electorate prefers most, and at the same time, that is a rights protective option, then the political cost is not a bad thing, not at all. Actually, in the Greek political vocabulary, political cost is a term used in a negative connotation, usually associated with populism, also, of course, used in a negative way. We often hear things like that. Politicians do not do the right thing because they are afraid of the political cost. There is, however, a nicer term to name the very same thing. It is called voter accountability. This, that elected politicians make decisions with due deference to the wishes of their constituencies, which in turn, the constituencies may electorally punish politicians who ignore those wishes. This is the quintessence of political responsibility, which in turn lies in the heart of parliamentary democracy. What does this story show us? It shows that rights are protected more effectively when we have a well-functioning democracy. That political responsibility is a very powerful mechanism of parliamentary democracy for rights protection, and that when political responsibility is not functioning effectively, then rights are in danger. Political decisions made in a constitutional democracy apparently are limited by the Constitution. Some political choices, for instance, oppressing the minorities, are clearly unconstitutional. It is often, however, that the Constitution is not clear about a certain political choice. Whether that choice will be regarded as permissible or not depends on the meaning that we give to the constitutional provisions. But who tells us what the Constitution means? For a long time now, the study of the Constitution has been dominated by legal scientists. The conventional legal constitutional approach wants the Constitution outside and above politics. The true meaning of the Constitution, according to this approach, lies in the hands of a professional elite of judges, legal scholars, and lawyers. These are people who have studied law, who professionally interpret the law, supposedly using exclusively legal methodology, which is, again, supposedly immune from the passions and the pettiness of politics. Ultimately, the last word in constitutional interpretation lies with those having the last word in the judicial system, that is, with the highest or supreme courts. It is for the courts to enforce the Constitution against the political majority of the day. It is to the courts that we appeal to when the majorities threaten our rights. Well, that is basically the conventional legal constitutional approach, although obviously I oversimplify here. This has been challenged in recent years by an alternative approach, which believes the Constitution to be not outside and above, but within politics. To be sure, this is not a clear and coherent trend, and certainly not a school of thought. Different versions of this approach appeared under the labels populist constitutionalism, or popular constitutionalism, or political constitutionalism. What they have in common is that they reject the dominant legalistic approach to the Constitution. The Constitution is no doubt a law, but it is not only that, it is also what constitutes us as a political community. Professional jurists certainly have a lot to tell us about the Constitution, but it is also important how we, the people, and our representatives perceive it, the Constitution. Populist constitutionalism contends that political parties, social movements, and ultimately the people themselves have an equal say on the constitutional meaning. The people, thus, do not just act as the constituent power, only to disappear thereafter, but they also shape, through the course of everyday politics, the way the constituted powers apply and interpret the Constitution. There are 3 books that have set the trend for this approach, which also present 3 different versions of it. The breakthrough came in 1999 with a book by Mark Tushnet, a law professor now in Harvard, then in Georgetown. The book's title is Taking the Constitution Away from the Courts. The final chapter of the book has the title Populist Constitutional Law. In 2004, a book by Larry Kramer, also a law professor and the dean of Stanford Law School, came. The book's title is The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and Judicial Review. Yet another version came in 2007 with a book by Richard Bellamy, a professor of political science at the University College of London. The book's title is Political Constitutionalism, subtitled A Republican Defense of the Constitutionality of Democracy. It is interesting that these 3 scholars have been working independently from each other in the sense that they do not seem to rely on each other's work, at least not to a worth mentioning extent. Nevertheless, and despite differences between them, their respective arguments could be regarded as different versions of a wider strand. Let me return to my initial example. The politicians that held power in Greece until recently have considered it as almost unthinkable to remove civil servants, although they could use a constitutional justification if they choose to do so. They could say something like that. You know, the Constitution does not allow us to remove civil servants from their posts, but it does allow us to abolish the posts and then remove the people that held them. This might appear as a rather simple constitutional rule. However, there is a quite complex legal problem behind it. The politician who evokes that rule has to answer an objection that goes something like that. And how do I know, sir, that you did not abolish the post that I happen to hold just because you want to remove me? What is implied here is that the Constitution does not allow an abuse of the power to abolish civil service posts that conceal a violation of the permanency clause. Any lawyer could tell you that whenever the words abuse and conceal come up in a legal dispute, this dispute is bound to end up with the defeated party believing that she suffered an injustice. So the wording of the Constitution does indeed allow politicians to abolish posts and then remove civil servants, but a distrustful electorate could easily question the intentions of the politicians who make use of that power. This is why, in the social perception, which has been confirmed and reinforced by a stable, until recently, legislative practice, the permanency rule has been simplified. Permanent means permanent, with no qualification, no so long as is written in the Constitution. That could be an example of populist constitutionalism, of how the meaning of the Constitution is shaped by the understandings of the people and through the functioning of the political system. Well, that might have been so, but it seems that it isn't anymore. For the first time in many years, we have recently seen civil servants to be actually removed and lose their jobs after their posts are abolished. More generally, we are currently experiencing in Greece a dramatic decline in the protection of rights, major losses not only in social and economic rights, but also in traditional civil liberties due to law and order policies. Even if some of the losses could be justified in times of crisis, it is not evident why this had to be done in such a scale, and especially why the burden of the losses had to be allocated in such an unequal way. One reason for the decline of rights protection is, I think, that in recent time we lost what I have tried to describe as populist or political constitutionalism. How this happened? I could only hint very briefly to three parallel developments. First, the extension of the anti-populist rhetoric to rights claims. Almost anyone, and certainly any group claiming social or economic rights, is labeled populist and accused of trying to keep privileges to the detriment of the community. Second, the gradual decrease of political responsibility. Politicians are liberated from the burden of voter accountability so that they can make unpopular decisions because they can put the blame to anybody else but them, be it the European Union, the Troika, or the international creditors. And third, the immense strengthening of the executive. Those unpopular decisions apparently are deemed so necessary that in order to prevent accidents by those who may still be concerned with their re-election, the parliament is bypassed and decisions are made directly through executive legislation. I'm afraid that I do not have any conclusions. What I have presented is meant primarily as a call to my colleagues, legal scientists, that they take more seriously developments in political science, and this present discussion about populism could prove extremely fruitful for lawyers, but also as a call to political scientists that they do not leave the Constitution to lawyers alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for your intervention, quite an interesting one, which demonstrates that lawyers can finally, and in the event, prove things and explain them right and correctly. And so you should not demean the position of lawyers. Secondly, we'll not go into another lawyer. We'll have a speech by our colleague, Professor Kioupkiolis, on lecturer, assistant professor, on hegemonic theory of contemporary democratic movements, not from a legal point of view. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to address a question that we have raised within the Populism project, and this concerns the relationship between the theory of hegemony as developed by Laclau and Mouffe with contemporary democratic movements, and especially the movements, social movements of the last 15 years. Now, the problem with this, the analysis of contemporary movements from from the perspective of the theory of hegemony, is that many analysts and theories of these movements have argued that they provide an instance of horizontal politics that are beyond hegemony, beyond the politics of hegemony. In effect, the political theory of many political theories, at least, in the last decade have issued many times the death certificate of hegemony, understood as the politics of identity, ideology, totality, the party and the state apparatus, representation, and hierarchical top-down power. For example, Richard Day, in his book that came out in 2005 and was entitled Gramsci is Dead, it's a very characteristic title, he argues that we should analyze contemporary democratic movements, such as the movement for global justice at the beginning of the century, in terms of a series of autonomous struggles which deny their articulation into a chain of equivalence and deny also hegemonic representation and prioritize instead physical intervention in the here and now, and autonomous struggles that enter into non-representational and non-centralized relations of affinity. Similar assumptions inform the literature on the global democratic insurrections of 2011, which spread from the Arab Spring to the Occupy movement in North America through the Spanish indignados and the Greek aganatismeni. The common assumption here in this literature is that these collective movements set out to construct and prefigure through their practices a new type of democracy which would overcome hegemonic politics by organizing autonomously in public spaces through collective experiments and direct grassroots action. These movements sought to establish processes of egalitarian consensual deliberation, which are open to all, welcome diversity, and create horizontal decentralized networks which enable collaboration without suppressing the freedom of singularities. This is an argument made by people like Hart and Negri and various others in the sociology of social movements. Now, these critical theories of horizontal politics and post-hegemony imply A, that the theory of hegemony could not be applied to contemporary democratic movements, and B, more widely, that perhaps a hegemonic conception of the people in democratic politics is no longer relevant for political analysis and practice today. Though what I will try to do is to try to address these objections by showing how the theory of hegemony is not only opposed to or something external to these movements, but is part of their internal structure. A way to address these objections, that the theory of hegemony is no longer relevant for contemporary movements, or that these movements themselves strive to overcome the politics of hegemony, would be to argue that this is true for the movements themselves, that they are organized in a horizontal, non-hierarchical, non-representational way, but we need to combine these forms of mobilization with hegemonic politics that engage with institutions and so on. This is one way to go, but I will follow another line, a line that was introduced by two analysts working from within the Essex School, that is Marina Predoulis and Lasse Thomasen, who in a paper that they published last year tried to show that the movements of the Spanish Indignados and the Greek Anarchismeni actually contain elements of hegemonic politics. So what I will try to do is, by looking at the movements of Indignados and the Occupy movement, I want to show that despite their explicit opposition, the explicit opposition of these movements to delegation, hierarchical organization, parties, political parties, ideological unity. Despite these facts, some basic elements of hegemony, that is representation, antagonism, uneven power, and chains of equivalence, which create collective identities around empty signifiers, are basic elements of their political discourse and their political action. I will start with the analysis that I mentioned before, a paper written by Predoulis and Thomas in 2012, who argued that the movements of Indignados and the equivalent Greek movement have not managed to avoid, I quote, the tensions between horizontality and verticality, between autonomy and hegemony, or between moving beyond representation and accepting representational structures. Even those currents in the Spanish Indignados and the Greek Anarchismeni, which dismissed in the most vociferous way political representation, admitted delegates from smaller assemblies or representatives from smaller assemblies, which assumed organizational and coordinating functions. They admitted that these coordinating functions and these representative functions are necessary and acceptable. Although general assemblies of these movements stated that they represented nobody beyond their actual movements, the movements, I quote from their paper, use spokespersons even if their status is checked in different ways, end of quote. Moreover, Predoulis and Thomasen argue that autonomy and horizontal relations are not immediate and spontaneous. They are enacted in the rules laid down by the assemblies, which enforce turn-taking, the use of sign language, the function of moderators, etc., with a view to setting up a space of egalitarian inclusion and participation. This space, Predoulis and Thomasen argue, is representational because it defines which voices will be included as equal through norms which determine what counts as equal voice. With their specific ways of counting, the Spanish and the Greek protesters will be able, I quote, will be able to represent themselves as equal. But the new order that they establish will be also a police order according to a new set of norms about who belongs to the community of equals. Furthermore, autonomy and horizontality were also instituted within the relations between the various local assemblies in Spain and Greece, whereby central assemblies occupied a nodal position in the network, giving rise to hierarchies among the assemblies. Consequently, Predoulis and Thomasen argue, I quote, there is no horizontality without verticality and no equality without inequality, because horizontality and equality are not natural but must be instituted, end of quote. Now, I will move now beyond their paper and their analysis to a discussion of the Occupy Wall Street movement, where we see that the central slogan of this movement, we are the 99%, makes a claim to representation, it constructs a collective identity, it presents a radical antagonism with a collective enemy, the elites of the top 1%, and it evokes a desire for a missing fullness of justice and equality. As Jody Dean has put it, I quote, Occupy Wall Street is not actually the movement of the 99% of the population of the United States. It is a movement mobilizing itself around an occupied Wall Street in the name of the 99%. asserting a division in relation to the fundamental antagonism, Occupy makes appear it represents the wrong of the gap between the rich and the rest of us. End of quote. The various Occupy mobilizations did not feature then a multitude in which the many are many without converging into a unity. They contained a multiplicity of individuals with diverse persuasions and demands and different groups struggling for particular causes. But they were all connected with the Occupy label and the 90% versus 1% master frame, which drew them all together in a common understanding of the rival, the system that places profits before people and the earth, and identified them with the entire set of aims and modes of resistance which were covered under the same label, the signifier Occupy Wall Street. They all struggled against material inequalities, debt, foreclosures, and the economic system that causes them all in full complicity with a corrupt representative government which no longer represents the people. And they came together in their refusal to make demands of the state and their common attempt to avoid electoral politics with political hierarchies. They championed instead a practice of plural collective deliberation and self-organization which were accessible equally to all in ways which publicly performed alternatives to capitalist democracy and enacted the vision of another more equal and democratic world. In this type of movement politics, I argue that many elements of hegemony as conceived by Laclau can be clearly detected. In a typically hegemonic fashion, Occupy set up a chain of equivalence among different demands, resistance, and activities by providing a supplementary common meaning to all of them. The chains of equivalence were organized around empty signifiers, such as Occupy and 90%, which were partly emptied of their original particular meaning to embrace a plurality of demands, pursuits, and significations, referring to an absent fullness of economic justice, democracy, and so on. Through these chains of equivalence and the empty signifiers, a particular force made up of the activists who effectively participated in the various actions of Occupy came forward as the representative of a near universality, the 99% of the people, in the context of an antagonism with a common rival, the 1%. Finally, although occupations were loosely connected as nodes in an open network, a degree of uneven concentration of power can be detected in them. There were some centers of power which played a leading part in the direction of the whole movement, such as the Zuccotti Park in the United States, Puerta del Sol in Spain, Syntagma Square in Athens, while various key working groups and committed activists sustained the encampments and were regularly involved in the General Assemblies. So, hegemony may refer to a type of political relation among movements or nodes, such as collectivity, struggles, formal and informal networks, organizations, and individuals, which make up a common movement and combine vertical with horizontal structures. Hegemony, as theorized in the work of Laclau and Mouffe, Hegemony and Social Strategy in 1985, is a logic of articulation of social relations. I quote, a type of political relations, which binds together different elements in chains of equivalence and invests them with a supplementary common identity in the context of an antagonism between rival camps which seeks to rearrange power relations in a particular field of society. Hence, it is not focused necessarily on the state, but it can be applied to different levels, such as the macro level of face-to-face interactions or the macro level of international relations, the status apparatus of civil society. The theoretical reconstruction of Gracian hegemony by Laclau and Mouffe was carried out, in effect, from a perspective which recognized the new features of new social movements in the 80s and the demands of autonomy and pluralism which they put forward. The logic of hegemony, as they flesh it out, does not seek to subordinate or to eliminate autonomous movements, but it is intended, on the contrary, to articulate them, so to enhance them and reinforce them. And here I will quote from the work. The forms of this struggle undertaken by the anti-racist movements will in part pass through the autonomization of certain activities and organizational forms, partly through systems of alliances with other forces, and partly through the construction of systems of equivalence among contents of different movements. For nothing can consolidate anti-racist struggles more than the construction of stable forms of overdetermination among such contents as anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-capitalism, which left to themselves do not necessarily tend to converge. Once again, autonomy is not opposed to hegemony, but is an internal moment of a wider hegemonic operation. Evidently, this operation does not necessarily pass through the party form, not through a single institutional form, nor through any other type of a priori arrangement. End of quote. Hence, hegemony and the project of radical democracy, which they proposed in this book, aim at a combination of verticality, hierarchy, unification, and concentration with horizontality understood as autonomy, pluralism, and equal liberty. The aim is, on the one hand, to foster the autonomous development of democratic struggles in a multiplicity of different social spaces, and at the same time to partly connect them so as to constitute a common front which will support their autonomous collective actions and will harmonize their goals with the democratic principles of equality and freedom for all. A radical democracy at that time would aspire to an articulation of freedom and equality which acknowledges and institutionally preserves the diversity of different social fields and spaces with their particular logics, along with the particular forms of freedom, equality, and democracy which they realize. This combination of verticality and horizontality in a hegemonic frame, as conceived by Laclau and Mouffe, does not occur once and for all and does not assume a fixed form, but it preserves the particularity of its political logic and strives for an ongoing synthesis, tension, mutual contamination, challenge, and interaction among them. I quote from their work, between the logic of complete identity and that of pure difference, the experience of democracy should consist of the recognition of the multiplicity of social logics along with the necessity of their articulation. But this articulation should be constantly recreated and renegotiated, and there is no final point at which a balance will be definitively achieved. End of quote. Now, the interesting thing is that recently, prominent scholars of social movements, sociologists and not political theorists, such as Sidney Tarrow, in a book which came out in a new edition in 2011 with the title Power in Movement, Social Movements and Contentious Politics, argued that the tension between a centralized coordination of collective actions by hierarchical, institutionalized organizations and on the one hand, and mobilizations undertaken by independent groups which cooperate through networks flexibly and provisionally, so the tension between hegemony and autonomy does not only recur regularly in contentious movement politics, but it should be sustained. This is a normative or a political point. It should be sustained, this tension, as a valuable, productive conflict by avoiding the final prevalence of one or another direction. It should be preserved within social movements themselves through various hybrid admixtures. The movements will be able, thus, Tarrow argues, to combine the enhancement of collective identity and a greater capacity for flexible mobilization, disruption, and contest, which are fostered by network horizontal forms, to combine this capacity and this collective identity with the effective coordination and sustained systematic interaction with allies and institutions, which is attained by centralized hierarchical structures. To conclude, it seems to me that at least three dimensions of hegemonic politics should be preserved as a matter of principle and not simply as a fact in radical democratic movements today. On the reasonable assumption that entrenched interests, plutocrats, and established oligarchies will not forsake voluntarily their power, their property, and their privileges, it will be necessary first to pursue hegemony as a struggle to reconfigure the existing composition of forces and to replace it with a different power structure which will strive to minimize domination, hierarchies, and exclusions. Second, even if one understands or envisions the struggles for freedom and equality today in terms of multiple conflicting assemblages, rather than as a global system or a united revolutionary front, A variable degree of hegemony, understood as collective unity and cohesion, will be still needed to avoid mutually destructive conflicts and incompatibilities. This unity and cohesion would be redundant only if social and individual differences harmonized spontaneously with each other, and destructive conflicts could be magically avoided without much effort. Third, relations of representation and the dialectics of particularity and universality, whereby a particular force assumes universal tasks and speaks in the name of the whole, will be reproduced in any political association in which the will of the many does not coincide with the will of all. Such a convergence is not a coincidence of the will of the many with the will of all, is not logically impossible, but it is empirically unlikely in societies of free and diverse individualities where no universal reason, nature, or homogeneous tradition guarantees the collective convergence of different values, understandings, and pursuits in political interactions. Now, and I'm moving to the end, I'm closing here. Another way to address the issue whether hegemonic politics is relevant for democratic politics today is to argue, as Antalmov has recently done, and Stavrakakis has also done, that the political practice of contemporary movements such as the Indignados and the Occupy Wall Street cannot provide a substitute for representative institutions, and we need to highlight the necessity for synergies and common action in the between social movements and more institutionalized hegemonic forms of politics, because this synergy and the common action can serve the purposes of a counter-hegemonic offensive today. Given our analysis so far, Stavrakakis has argued, it is reasonable to conclude that when that fails to happen, that is, and here he quotes from the work of Antalmov, when protest movements refuse to establish alliances with traditional channels that they deemed as intrinsically impervious to democratic transformation, then their radical potential will be drastically weakened. So, and I will conclude with this, the aim that we have set, the research objectives that we have set in this project in analyzing such social movements as populist movements will be to explore the potential populism of these movements as we have defined populism in the project, using the conceptual apparatus of the theory of hegemony, whose pertinence we sought to establish through this argument that I summarized. This kind of research may contribute to a critical reappraisal of the opposition between the people and the multitude as modes of democratic subjectivity today, muddling the dividing lines between them. And a key research question that we will explore concerns the different forms of political representation and leadership, open, collective, anti-hierarchical, in plural platforms and so on, which are proposed and elaborated by radical democratic movements today, and the types of political representation that would be pertinent and effective for an institutional renewal of representative democracy today. Hence, we will be looking at the articulation of autonomous movements with new parties, such as the Party of Podemos in Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandros. Thank you for your interesting insight into the difficulties of democracy in democratic movements. We will continue now with a sort of dualistic analysis of the political ethics of populism by Professor Tsibiridou from the University of Macedonia and Michalis Bartsidis from the Aristotle University. From what I understand, Michalis will start, or Fotini will start, and you will have a sort of dialogue which will be a fruitful dialogue, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The lecture will be in Greek.
Yes, and that's why we have to apologize for the English speakers of this audience that was a misunderstanding for the translation, so we missed the translation of our paper. And as I was abroad, it was very difficult for us to communicate. We were lost in communication. In fact, we have two different versions of the paper we're going to present, so it will be a kind of stand-up comedy. We will speak in Greek, and I hope at the end we have a summary a little bit. And
okay. Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Στην εισήγησή μας αναλαμβάνουμε να συμμετάσχουμε στη συζήτηση για τον λαϊκισμό και αναλαμβάνουμε αυτό το εγχείρημα της θετικής ενιολόγησης του. Όπως αντιλαμβανόμαστε ότι εγγράφεται μέσα στο όλο project. Θεωρούμε όμως ως απαραίτητη προϋπόθεση για το σκοπό αυτό να επερωτήσουμε πρώτον την έννοια του λαού και θα το κάνουμε όσον αφορά την ρουσοϊκή στιγμή του ορισμού του λαού, από μία σκοπιά, από μια φιλοσοφική προσέγγιση που αποκαλούμε διατομική και βάζω σε παρένθεση τον αγγλικό όρο transindividual and not intersubjective. Στη συνέχεια θα παρουσιάσουμε, θα αναπτύξουμε ή εν πάση περιπτώσει θα διερευνήσουμε συνοπτικά την πρόταση μιας πολιτικής ηθικής για τον λαϊκισμό, με βάση την κοινή έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας, όπως αυτή αναδύθηκε στα παγκοσμιοτοπικά κινήματα των πλατιών, των Ειρηνιάντος, της πλατείας Ταχρήρ κτλ. Και τέλος, η πρότασή μας θα οδηγήσει αυτήν την ενιολόγηση του λαού προς την επαναφορά της ευθύνης, της έννοιας της ευθύνης, ως αμφίσιμης έννοιας, ως αρετής της πολιτιότητας, μια civic virtue, σε ένα διπλό γίγνεσθε χειραφέτησης και υπακοής, που είναι και κατά κάποιο τρόπο η απάντησή μας στο ερώτημα αν η έννοια του multitude, η έννοια των μαζών, οδηγείται τελικά σε ένα γίγνεσθε πολίτης, υπό μία έννοια σύμφωνα με την πρόταση που ανέπτυξε και ο Άρης νωρίτερα σε ένα διάλογο με την πρόταση του Ετιέν Μπαλιμπάρ. Ξεκινώντας από το πρώτο θέμα, τον ορισμό του λαού, θα μπορούσαμε να αναφέρουμε μία απορριτική φράση του Χέγκελ, ο οποίος, εκφράζοντας την αμηχανία του, έγραψε για τον ανόργανο τρόπο που γνωστοποιεί ο λαός τι θέλει και τι σκέπτεται. Ήδη μέσα σε αυτήν την μικρή φράση του Χέγκελ, ο ανόργανος τρόπος που ο λαός γνωστοποιεί τι θέλει και τι σκέφτεται, αναδύονται πάρα πολλά στοιχεία για να σκεφτεί κανείς έναν ορισμό του λαού. Πράγμα πάρα πολύ δύσκολο, όπως το εξήγησε ο Γεράσιμος Βόκος, αλλά, εν πάση περιπτώσει, υπάρχει αυτή η απορριτική έκφραση, ο ανόργανος τρόπος, που μας παραπέμπει σε μια έννοια της σχέσης που μπορεί να αποτελεί ο ίδιος ο λαός ή μιας έννοιας της δομής. Όσον αφορά το στοιχείο που γνωστοποιεί τι θέλει, μπορεί να μας παραπέμψει στην έννοια της βούλησης, και το τι σκέπτεται, το πνεύμα, η ψυχή, μπορεί να μας παραπέμψει στην δεύτερη φάση ορισμού του λαού στο γερμανικό folk, στην περίοδο του ρομαντισμού. Συνεπώς, μπορούμε από αυτήν την φράση του Χέγκελ να πάμε στην πρώτη στιγμή στον Ρουσό και στην δεύτερη στιγμή στον γερμανικό ρομαντισμό. Τον λαό ως γενική βούληση και τον λαό ως πνεύμα, ψυχή, κουλτούρ ή σκέπτεστε. Λοιπόν, το πρώτο παράδειγμα της γενικής βούλησης στον λαό, volonté générale στον Ρουσό, θα το εξετάσουμε, προτείνουμε να το εξετάσουμε ως ένα παράδειγμα μιας έννοιας, μιας αρχής, μιας παράστασης, η οποία δεν είναι αυτό που ερμηνεύτηκε σχεδόν επί 2 αιώνες, ότι είναι μια παράσταση του όλου μέσα στο οποίο εντάσσονται τα άτομα και συγκροτούν το λαό, αλλά από την διατομική, από την transindividual σκοπιά, προτείνουμε να την αντιμετωπίσουμε ως μια παράσταση διαφορετικού τύπου, ως μια αριθμιστική ιδέα, μέσω της οποίας επιτρέπεται να συγκροτείται ο κυρίαρχος πολίτης, ο σουβερέν, και ταυτοχρόνως ο υπήκοος πολίτης. Δηλαδή, μέσω της έννοιας της γενικής βούλησης συγκροτείται τόσο ο πολίτης όσο και το υποκείμενο. Σύμφωνα με αυτή την διαλεκτική του Μπαλιμπάρ, sitio gen sujet. Εάν λοιπόν αντιληφθούμε την volonté générale όχι ως μια κλειστή έννοια, που έτσι την αντιλήφθηκε η κοινωνιολογία επί πολλά χρόνια και ίσως και η πολιτική θεωρία, αλλά την ανοίξουμε και την αντιληφθούμε ως μια παράσταση η οποία επιτρέπει μια διπλή διαδικασία, τότε έχουμε μπροστά μας ένα πρώτο παράδειγμα μιας παράστασης η οποία μπορεί να χρησιμεύσει στο να καταστήσει τον λαό ορατό ή να κάνει τον λαό αισθητό, σύμφωνα με την ρασιαριανή έννοια της πολιτικής ως aesthetics. Δηλαδή χρειάζεται πάντοτε μία παράσταση, ούτως ώστε αυτό το ανόργανος τρόπος να γίνει αισθητός, να εκπροσωπηθεί. Θα δούμε με ποιον τρόπο, που είναι όλη η συζήτηση για το representation. Ναι.
Λοιπόν, σε αυτή την θετική ενιολόγηση της έννοιας του λαού θα πρέπει δυστυχώς να προσθέσουμε την περιπέτεια που αποκρισταλώθηκε στην εποχή του Ρωμαντισμού και σχετίζεται με την διάκριση μεταξύ υψηλής και χαμηλής κουλτούρας. Αυτό ξεκινάει βέβαια από την εποχή των Φώτων και διακρίνει αρνητικά όσους εντάσσονται στην κατηγορία του λαού για να τους συναντέψει με τα στερεότυπα της παιδικότητας και της ανοριμότητας, στη συνέχεια της μίμησης των υψηλών στρωμάτων και του kitsch, όπως προκύπτει τελευταία, όπως βέβαια και με τις αμφίσιμες ιδιότητες της αυθεντικότητας της παράδοσης, του εθνικού φρονήματος κλπ. Στην ίδια τάση, κατά τη γνώμη μας, εγγράφεται και ο παρεπόμενος όρος του λαϊκισμού, έτσι όπως χρησιμοποιείται στη διάρκεια του 20ου αιώνα, συνήθως από την πολιτική επιστήμη. Οι αρνητικές συνδηλώσεις του λαού σχετίζονται βεβαίως με το πνεύμα και το συναίσθημά του. Βλέπετε την παράδοση τη γερμανική του Volkskunde και του το οποίο θεωρήθηκε ότι ανήκει στον αντίποδα του ορθού λόγου, της επιστημονικότητας κλπ. Έτσι γεννιέται η αμφισημία που συνοδεύει την έννοια σε όλη τη διάρκεια της νεωτερικότητας για να οδηγήσει στην αμφιθυμία με την οποία αντιμετωπίζονται οι πρακτικές σήμερα όσων βιώνουν έναν λαϊκό τρόπο ζωής. Θα δούμε ποιος είναι σε κάθε παράδειγμα. Ή επικαλούνται τη βάση της νομιμοποίησης της ύπαρξής τους στη βάση αυτής της λαϊκότητας. Αυτή η νομιμοποίηση τους κάνει να χαίρονται και συγχρόνως να ντρέπονται για αυτό που κάνουν πολλές φορές. Η ανάλυση μας, όπως ήδη είπαμε, είναι διτή, βασίζεται σε μια ανθρωπολογική παρατήρηση από τη δική μου τη σκοπιά και σε ένα φιλοσοφικό στοχασμό από τη σκοπιά του Μιχάλη. Στη συγκεκριμένη περίπτωση, ακολουθώντας το πνεύμα της πολιτισμικής κριτικής και με συνεχή αυτοαναφορικότητα από τις έρευνες πεδίου, από το πεδίο, αντλούμε παραδείγματα από έργα όπως είναι το κοινωνικό, πολιτικό και πολιτισμικό λεξικό της δεκαετίας του 80, όπου συνάδελφοι αναστοχάζονται μέσα από τον κινηματογράφο, τη λογοτεχνία, την μουσική, αλλά και τις έρευνες πεδίου στο τι συνέβη σε πάνω στην έννοια του λαϊκού και της λαϊκότητας. Και όλα αυτά βέβαια προσπαθούμε να τα δούμε μέσα από μια νοστοχαστική νοσταλγία και των δικών μας εμπειριών και ιδιαίτερα των εθνογραφικών ερευνών πεδίου που έχουν πραγματοποιηθεί γύρω από αυτά. Επομένως, μας ενδιαφέρει αυτό το lifestyle στην πολιτική και την αισθητική της καθημερινότητας που γέννησε η δεκαετία του 80 για να καταλήξουμε σε αυτό της Ελλάδας της κρίσης, έτσι συμβατικά να πούμε τον όρο. Και με αυτήν την έννοια μας ενδιαφέρουν οι εικόνες με τις οποίες ο λαός γίνεται αισθητός, άρα αναπαραστάσιμος. Επικεντρώνουμε στο παράδειγμα της Ελλάδας από τη δεκαετία του 80 μέχρι σήμερα, σε μια πρόθεση να ιστορικοποιήσουμε αυτήν την έννοια του λαού και της λαϊκότητας, φυσικά λαμβάνοντας υπόψη ότι πρόκειται να μιλήσουμε, όλα αυτά προκύπτουν ως αποτέλεσμα παγκοσμιοτοπικών εμπειριών, δηλαδή δεν προκύπτουν σε ένα κενό ούτε σε έναν απομονωτισμό. Έτσι λοιπόν καταλήγουμε στις... Λοιπόν, πώς συγκροτείται η έννοια του λαού από τα κάτω, η χρήση και η κατάχρηση της έννοιας λαός στη συγκρότηση της ελληνικής ταυτότητας έφερε την πρώτη διάκριση μεταξύ αστικών ελίτ και λοιπόν λαϊκών μαζών με αγροτικές καταβολές. Στους τελευταίους αναζητήθηκαν τα επιβιώματα της ελληνικότητας, αλλά και η αισθητική της ευρωπαϊκής καλαισθησίας απέρριπτε ή συμμόρφωνε κάθε γνήσια μορφή εκφραστικότητας, με αποτέλεσμα να έχουμε τη δημιουργία του folklore ή του, βλέπε, της καθαρεύουσας, του αρχοντορεμπέτικου κλπ. Στη δεκαετία του 80 όμως είχαμε την απελευθέρωση της λαϊκότητας με όρους κυριολεκτικά πια, αναφέρομαι σε έναν συγκεκριμένο δίσκο που είχε βγει την εποχή του Papageorgiou Ρασούλης, η εκδίκηση της γυφτιάς. Αλλά η νομιμοποίηση του λαϊκού από την εξουσία και τη διακυβέρνηση παρήγαγε μια νέα ετεροπροσδιοριστική διάκριση μεταξύ τώρα των κουλτουριάριδων από τη μια και των νεόπλουτων μικρομεσαίων στρωμάτων. Αναφέρομαι και στη διαμάχη που υπήρξε στο περιοδικό Αντί, με το κάτι το ωραίο, που εκεί πια διακρίνεται αυτό που παράγεται ως λαϊκό από τους μικρομεσαίους ως κιτς. Οι διακρίσεις είχαν και εξακολουθούν να έχουν αξιολογικό χαρακτήρα σε βάρος της λαϊκότητας, της λαϊκής εκφραστικότητας διονυσιακού χαρακτήρα, όπου εξαίρεται το συναίσθημα, σε αντίστοιξη με την αυτοσυγκράτηση της απολώνιας ομορφιάς νεοκλασικού στυλ και των τρόπων ζωής που μέσα από τα ευρωπαϊκά ήθη. Η λαϊκή επιτελεστικότητα υπό τη συνθήκη του ατομικού ευδαιμονισμού και της επιδεικτικής κατανάλωσης αυτή τη δεκαετία, που ξεκινάει από αυτή τη δεκαετία και κορυφώνεται το 1990, παρήγαγε δύο τάσεις. Αφενός την αισθητική ευθαιρεσία και αυθάδεια από τους μικρομεσαίους, όπου από τα Λούμπεν σκυλάδικα περάσαμε στις ανοιχτές πίστες, αφετέρου την κοινική αδιαφορία με όρους θυμοσοφίας στους άλλους χώρους, αυτούς τους χώρους των έξω, αυτούς που θέλανε να μείνουν έξω από την πολιτική εκπροσώπηση, τους αντιεξουσιαστικούς, και όπου εκεί βέβαια υπήρχε κοφαντική σιωπή σε ό,τι αφορά την πολιτική διεκδίκηση. Και όλα αυτά βέβαια είχαμε την κορύφωση όλο αυτό με την παράσταση και την επιτελεστικότητα της Ολυμπιάδας του 2004. Να σας θυμίσω κάποιες εικόνες, την τελετή έναρξη και την τελετή λήξης του Παπαϊωάννου. Νομίζω ότι δεν χρειάζεται να πω παραπάνω. Και ύστερα ήρθε η κρίση και η Τρόικα και φαίνεται ότι η λαϊκότητα συναντά τις κινητοποιήσεις. Πού? Πρώτα απ' όλα στις πλατείες. Η αναζήτηση της χαμένης αξιοπρέπειας μας βάζει να αναστοχαστούμε πάνω στο πώς ένας όρος τόσο αμφίσιμος, αφού κινείται μεταξύ της ντροπής, της φιλοτιμίας, της ευθύνης, της χειραφέτησης και των δικαιωμάτων από την άλλη μεριά, γίνεται μια κοινή έννοια. Για αριστερούς και δεξιούς, μια κοινή έννοια που μάλλον τείνει να προσδιορίσει την μετά τις πλατείες κινηματική δράση από τη μια, ενώ την επικαλείται και ο συντηρητικός χώρος από την άλλη. Αυτή η κοινή έννοια των αγανακτισμένων και μετά που περνά στα κινήματα, φέρει τα βιωματικά χαρακτηριστικά της εμπειρίας. Η πρότασή μας, επομένως, είναι πριν αποφανθούμε για τη θετική ή αρνητική ενιολόγηση και την πολιτική χρήση του λαϊκισμού, να ενσκύψουμε σε αυτές τις κοινές έννοιες, όπως η αξιοπρέπεια, που τροφοδοτούν τη λαϊκότητα στην πράξη. Και δεν είναι μόνο η αξιοπρέπεια, στην περίπτωση της κινηματικής δράσης είναι οι πρακτικές αλληλεγγύης που φυσικά κινητοποιούν συναισθήματα φόβου όταν δεν είναι αλληλέγγυα, αλλά αγάπης και γενεοδορίας όταν είναι. Αυτή η ευθύνη λοιπόν, που είναι και αυτή με διτούς όρους μπορεί να γίνει αντιληφθή, είναι ένα δίκοπο μαχαίρι, το δίκοπο μαχαίρι των συναισθημάτων μεταξύ του αμοραλισμού, στην ελληνική περίπτωση της οικογενειοκρατίας, που πυροδοτεί τον φόβο και την ανθρωποφαγία από τη μια, και από την άλλη την πολιτικοποίηση της ηθικής, που κινητοποιεί βασικά συναισθήματα γενεοδορίας και αλληλεγγύης. Και εδώ μια μικρή, πολύ μικρή, πριν δώσω το λόγο στο Μιχάλη για να κάνει το επιχείρημα, μια πολύ μικρή παρέμβαση, ότι αυτό που αγνοήθηκε από την πολιτική επιστήμη όλο αυτό το διάστημα, είναι ότι σε μια απλή πράξη πολιτιότητας του Έλληνα πολίτη, του Αιγύπτιου πολίτη και άλλων πολιτών, η επένδυση και η επιστράτευση των συναισθημάτων που απαιτούνται προκειμένου να επιτελεστεί αξιοπρεπώς μια απλή πράξη πολιτιότητας. Βλέπεις συναλλαγές με τον κρατικό μηχανισμό, γραφειοκρατία, δημόσια διοίκηση, εκπαίδευση, αστυνομία, περίθαλψη, για να διεκδικήσει κάποιος πια τα αυτονόητα δικαιώματά του σε ατομικό ή συλλογικό επίπεδο. Άρα, εδώ σταματώ και δίνω το λόγο στο Μιχάλη για το επιχείρημα.
Ωραία, θα ήθελα να μείνουμε για λίγο στην στιγμή των πλατιών, όπου εκεί θα ήθελα για λίγο να αναπτύξουμε αυτό το μοντέλο, το διατομικό μοντέλο που προτείνουμε για την εκτίμηση όλης αυτής της υπόθεσης. Κατά τη γνώμη μας, είναι μια απάντηση στο ερώτημα που είναι ερώτημα όλου του συνεδρίου, πώς αυτοοργανώνεται, πώς αυτομετασχηματίζεται ο λαός. Κατά τη γνώμη μας, στις πλατείες και στην Πουέρτο ντελ Σόλ και στην Ταχρήρ, κυρίως δε στο Σύνταγμα ίσως λιγότερο, ήμασταν μάρτυρες μιας πρωτότυπης και αυθεντικής ιστορικής διαδικασίας, όπου οι μάζες, ο λαός, υπό μία έννοια, κινήθηκαν σε αυτήν την μετάβαση μεταξύ του πόλου των συναισθημάτων προς τον πόλο του λόγου. Και αυτό έχουμε πάρα πολλά στοιχεία τα οποία μπορούμε να το στηρίξουμε, αλλά το βασικότερο, δεν υπήρξε βία, για παράδειγμα, και διάφορα άλλα σημεία. Το βασικότερο όμως είναι ότι κάνουμε έναν ελιγμό και δεν εξετάζουμε αυτόν καθ' αυτόν τον όρο αγανακτισμένοι, αλλά τον όρο με τον οποίο μίλησαν οι αγανακτισμένοι, που είναι η έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας. Εάν μείνουμε στην έννοια της αγανάκτησης, υπάρχει μια ολόκληρη ιστορία στον Σπινόζα κτλ. Που κατά τη γνώμη μας οδηγεί σε λάθος συμπεράσματα. Προτιμούμε την ανάγνωση, εν πάση περιπτώσει, μέσω της κοινής έννοιας της αξιοπρέπειας, dignity, η οποία ήταν αυτή που τελικά έκανε αυτήν την στιγμή του πάθους, τις θυμικές στιγμές, τις τεχνικές του σώματος να εκφραστούν με μία έννοια. Νομίζουμε ότι δεν πρέπει να αφήσουμε ανεκμετάλλευτη αυτή την ιστορική περίπτωση, διότι η έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας, όπως εξήγησε προηγουμένως η κ. Tsibiridou, έχει μια χαρακτηριστική αμφισημία. Μπορεί να τη δει κανείς σε ένα λόγο δεξιό, ακροδεξιό, μπορεί να τη δει και σε ένα λόγο αριστερό. Και σε αυτό το σημείο τεμνόμαστε με το αίτημα για έναν αριστερό λαϊκισμό, και διότι τι είναι το project του λαϊκισμού παρά κυρίως η εκμετάλλευση των αμφισημιών. Και σε αυτό το σημείο, αν αναλύουμε από την έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας και την χαρακτηρίζουμε ως κοινή έννοια, με την σπινοζική σημασία, τον όρο των σπινοζικών κοινές έννοιες, που δεν συμπίπτουν με το common sense, είναι διαφορετικό πράγμα, και ίσως θα μπορούσε να γίνει μια συζήτηση εδώ πέρα με όλο το discourse analysis. Το θέμα μας λοιπόν είναι ότι επέτρεψαν με αυτήν την έννοια την μετάβαση από τον πόλο των παθών και την διαχείριση των συναισθημάτων προς τον λόγο σε αυτά τα ιστορικά παραδείγματα που είδαμε. Προτείνουμε λοιπόν την κοινή έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας για να αντιληφθούμε πώς έγινε ο λαός αισθητός στην περίπτωση αυτή. Η αμφισημία λοιπόν της έννοιας της αξιοπρέπειας είναι δίκοπο μαχαίρι, όπως είπαμε, και με αυτήν την έννοια μπορούμε όντως να απαντήσουμε θετικά στο εγχείρημα αν ο λαϊκισμός μπορεί να χρησιμοποιηθεί σε επίπεδο κεντρικής πολιτικής με θετικό πρόσημο. Ο λαϊκισμός πράγματι μπορεί να νοηθεί ότι διαθέτει δύο τάσεις, και η αμφίσιμη έννοια της αξιοπρέπειας που επικαλούνται οι μάζες και το πλήθος μπορούν να μας βοηθήσουν να δούμε πώς αποκρισταλώνονται οι διαφορές στην πράξη. Η αμφισημία της έννοιας της αξιοπρέπειας συνίσταται στο ότι η πρώτη χρήση της συνδέεται με μια ηθικοποίηση της πολιτικής διαδικασίας, και αυτό είναι που κάνουν όλοι οι δεξιά παράταξη, ηθικοποιεί την πολιτική, αλλά η δεύτερη οδηγεί σε μια πολιτικοποίηση της ηθικής. Ας σκεφτούμε ότι η επιστροφή της μοραλιστικής ηθικής και ειδικότερα κάθε συντηρητικής και αντιδραστικής πολιτικής βασίζεται στον στιγματισμό και την απόθεση της ελευθερίας και της ισότητας ως υπερβολικών και καταστροφικών του κοινωνικού δεσμού στοιχείων. Αντιθέτως, η νοηματοδότησή τους μέσω της αξιοπρέπειας ως απαραίτητων ιδεών και αξιών, μιλάμε για την ισότητα και την ελευθερία, δηλαδή η αξιοπρέπεια μεσολαβεί μεταξύ ισότητας και ελευθερίας, ώστε να καταστεί ιστορικά, να επανέλθει αυτό το ντετουνεμάν που έλεγε το πριν Σαντάλ Μουφ της ισοελευθερίας, ως ένα καθολικό ιδεώδες για την επανεκκίνηση της πολιτικής, των δικαιωμάτων, του λαού κτλ. Η δεύτερη αυτή επιστροφή, λοιπόν, δεν είναι μια γραμμική επιστροφή από το παρελθόν, αλλά παράγεται από τα κάτω, και αυτό θέλουμε να τονίσουμε. Παράγεται από τα κάτω αυτή η αξία, η σχεσιακή αυτή η αξία, όχι ως ένα απόλυτο μοραλιστικό ιδεώδες, αλλά ως ένα σχεσιακό πολιτικό ιδεώδες που μπορεί να επιτελέσει αυτό το ρόλο που προτείνουμε. Συνεπώς, όχι σε μια προκαθορισμένη ηθική και πολιτική, ναι στην αμφισημία, που μας επιτρέπει να επινοήσουμε κάποιες ιδέες, κάποιες παραστάσεις που μπορούν να βοηθήσουν αυτήν την εκπροσώπηση, μάλλον την μη εκπροσώπηση της εκπροσώπησης. Σε αυτήν την αναπαράσταση του μη αναπαραστάσιμου που είναι ο λαός. Νομίζω σε μια αντινέγκρη κατεύθυνση. Και αυτό φαίνεται από το γεγονός, λοιπόν, να συνεχίσω, ναι, ότι μας οδηγεί, για να κλείσουμε, ότι οδηγεί σε μια επαναφορά της πολιτικής ηθικής, μιας έννοιας της ευθύνης, ως πολιτικής αρετής, ως αρετής πολιτιότητας, την οποία θα μπορούσαμε να μπούμε σε λεπτομέρειες, αλλά δεν έχουμε το χρόνο. Το θέμα είναι ότι ο ορισμός του λαού που προτείναμε στην αρχή μας οδηγεί σε μια σύλληψή του τόσο ως την πλευρά της μιας πράξης χειραφιτησιακής, όσο και ως προς την εγγραφή του σε ένα θεσμικό επίπεδο, που μπορεί ταυτοχρόνως να είναι δηλαδή πολίτης και υποκείμενο. Με μια νέα έννοια της πολιτικής ευθύνης και με μια θετική σημασιοδότηση του λαϊκισμού. Ευχαριστούμε.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting dialogue in the original Greek sense, I think, and quite productive as well. Without further ado, I'll pass the floor to the last speaker for this session, who is hidden behind the screen, but he's still there.
We would change.
Yannis Skalidakis is a postdoctoral fellow with the School of Political Sciences, and he's going to deal with the subject of the people and the nation in the discourse of the World War II Greek resistance. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation. So I'm rather a historian, so my presentation may be a bit different than the previous ones. I'll start. During the occupation of Greece by the Axis powers in the Second World War, a powerful resistance movement emerged in the form of EAM, that means National Liberation Front, an initiative of the Greek Communist Party. Like elsewhere, in Greece also the resistance movement combined the struggle for national liberation with a program of post-war social transformations. The post-war ascent to power presupposed the construction of a vast social alliance and thus a subsequent strategy. An according discourse was applied not only to describe, but also in a performative way to change the correlations of forces. The final political goal of the Communist Party was described as a variation of people's or popular democracy. Laokratia was the name, or laocracy, if you can understand that. And, but the main slogan throughout the war remained that of national unity. The correlation between those two notions will be our topic. The political line of the Greek Communist Party during the war had a fundamental basis in an open letter of its jailed General Secretary Nikos Zachariadis a few days after the Italian invasion in autumn 1940. In this letter, the war was described as one of national independence against fascist aggression. In this trend, the mot d'ordre was national liberation. The working people of Greece should defend their homeland, and their prize would be a new Greece, free and independent, with a true popular civilization or culture. The political line followed the policy of anti-fascist fronts by the 7th Congress of the Communist International in August 1935. In that Congress, the idea of popular anti-fascist fronts was promoted, fronts that could possibly ascend to power. The concept of mutual relation of struggle for democracy and socialism was shaped, and also the estimation of the Congress was that in advanced countries the revolutionary process will proceed not through direct revolution, but rather through an indirect level of anti-fascist pan-democratic struggle. In Greece, this frontal policy of the Communist Party had begun since 1934 with an analysis of the Greek society and the forthcoming revolution as of a bourgeois democratic nature quickly evolving to a socialistic one. The creation of the necessary popular front should be done from down to top, inside the trade unions, etc. In Greece, the Communist Party proceeded to a policy forming a popular front against fascism, but in the summer of 1936, the dictatorship of Yannis was established until the breaking of the war. For that reason, for the reason of making a mass frontal policy, the Communist Party changed its policy regarding national issues to a more patriotic stance. Since then, the national questions would be a basic parameter of the Communist Party's policy, promoting the idea of national independence. And since 1939, the General Secretary spoke of the need of a national front. That line, which was in divergence with the policy of the Comintern then, during the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was successful during occupation. So this policy during the war was a continuation of the Popular Front line, extended to a National Front line, and then to a National Liberation Front. Now, during the war, in the first important assembly of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, in the summer of 1941, the war was again characterized as of national liberation and against fascism, and the elements of the policy that led to the formation of EAM were established. That was, first of all, the struggle against the invaders and the occupiers, and then the formation of a provisional all-party government that will restore democratic rights and civil liberties and call for a constitutional assembly. The main goal was the formation of a national front. Concerning the social issues, the decisions mentioned, the decision of the party mentioned that the communists should enlighten, just that, enlighten the people, that only a popular or people's power of workers and peasants would be a final solution to their sufferings. In the next assembly of the Communist Party, weeks before the foundation of EAM, the struggle for national liberation was described as a part of the proletarian struggle for the final liberation of the people from every economic and political oppression. Finally, in September 1941, the National Liberation Front EAM was founded, and in its inaugural proclamation, the aim of the country's liberation was highlighted along with the following formation of a provisional government by EAM in order to organize free elections for a constitutional assembly. In January 1942, the decision of the next assembly had a paragraph concerning popular democracy as the post-war goal of the party. This goal was vaguely described, focusing on the unrestrained participation of the popular masses in the post-war reconstruction of the country. It was emphasized that this political goal was not a condition to the cooperation of all political parties in the National Liberation Front and struggle. But within 1942, EAM started growing rapidly in the capital and the countryside. Successful strikes were organized and the guerrilla warfare also began. EAM organizations were successful, especially in the public sector, cooperatives and solidarity institutions, but also were spreading in the countryside. But the modern, more, I would say, mild-tempered program of EAM were more or less rejected by all the established parties that feared the ascension of the left. So in that level, the prospect of a real, complete national front was an impasse from the beginning. In the end of that year, the Communist Party estimated that radical changes were transforming Greek society and revolutionized the popular masses. On that ground, the coalition of all national, social rather than political forces was possible within EAM. So the two distinct goals, national liberation and post-war restoration of public rights and liberties, were coming closer to each other. The second goal was described as a popular people's solution of the domestic regime. After that, the path was wide open for the strategic goal of popular democracy, which would lead to socialism and so on. The proclamation towards the Greek people gave emphasis to the unity of the people, putting aside all differences and divisions, political, ideological, or party differences. But as the same could not be said regarding social divisions, the exclusion of a part of the society from this unity were to be described with national terms. It was the enemies and the traitors of the people, those that didn't join the national struggle and collaborated with the enemy. We know now that collaboration was a bigger phenomenon with social characteristics as well. But as in the discourse of EAM, the struggle was national and every social issue was avoided and postponed after the war, it is obvious why a similar discussion about massive collaboration social, economic, political one, was avoided. People and nation were tending to be identical in EAM's discourse. The problem was that if national unity could not be accomplished in a political level with all the parties, who would represent this united people, see the nation? As the situation hardened, the idea of accomplishing national unity within the ranks of EAM gained ground. In the same time, the institutions of EAM in the vast liberated part of the country since 1943, known as Free Greece, institutions of popular people's administration, people's justice, were seen and presented as a future model for laokratia. Subsequent adjectives like laokratikos or laokratumenos, etc., were in use to give a color to another otherwise national discourse and to differentiate the idea of EAM regarding national unity from other projects. For example, EAM was calling for unity to all parties that accepted the laokratiki, the people's basis of resolving Greek society's problems. In summer 1943, the first official negotiations between the representatives of EAM and that of the government in exile and other political parties failed. Since then, the rhetoric of the Communist Party hardened toward the other political forces, transferring gradually the issue of national unity from the level of the unity of the political forces to the unity of the people within EAM. As the other parties began their anti-EAM propaganda on a nationalistic basis of irredentist claims, the Communist Party responded by accusing them on the same ground, that of lack of patriotism. What was laokratia? In the spring of 1943, the Communist Party published a famous brochure in tens of thousands of copies under the title Laokratia and Socialismos, Laocracy and Socialism, presenting its post-war political program. Initially, once again, was stressed the absolute priority for the communists, that was the liberation of the country, and that this liberation would be tightly linked to a popular people's liberation, laokratiki, απελευθέρωση, and socialistic reconstruction of the country. According to this fundamental text, popular democracy was the power of the working people that resolves the vital problems of the country according to the interests of the people. It is the only form of government that could mobilize all forces of the Greek people in order to deal with the war damages and to solve the democratic problems of Greece, opening the road for more progressive evolution. Popular democracy was described as the people's regime in its more vast notion, a coalition of workers, peasants, entrepreneurs, manufacturers, public servants, intelligentsia, soldiers, youth, etc. The biggest possible majority of the nation having only one enemy, the reactionary, oppressing big bourgeoisie. The initial measures proposed in that program were presented, firstly, the first ones as the completion of an unfinished bourgeois revolution, and others went beyond that, like nationalization of the main banks and monopolies and railways, ports, etc. And also a series of welfare measures, raise of wages, and also political rights, equal rights for women, and political rights, protection of the youth, etc. We could say that it was a rather modest progressive program in a time that socialism was on the rise after the foreseen defeat and failure of fascism and the opening of a new era that then they didn't know what was to come. But the main question for EAM and the Communist Party was to gain massive support and to construct a vast alliance before the liberation. And it was not so the programs that mattered than the everyday policy defending the people. So the prefiguration of laokratia passed through the participation of the people in the liberated areas in a series of institutions, local authorities, all kinds of committees regarding education, health, youth, etc., popular justice, popular self-government, cooperatives, and so on. As Free Greece, the liberated area was a vast area in the size of Switzerland, with more than 1 million inhabitants, a sui generis kind of state was formed with its own forms of governments. The Communist Party, through its members and cadres, was in fact the state in the big part, the state mechanism in the big part of the country that was liberated. While, in the same time, in the central political scene, the Communist Party promoted the coalitions with the rest of the political world and the accomplishment of the national unity. In the social level, the Communist Party tried to apply this political line also by becoming, after also the abolishment of the Communist International, to become all people's party, and accomplishing thus this unity within its ranks. That, as expected, resulted to mass inscriptions to the party with rather unpleasant outcomes. So there was an ideal of a dual strategy that EAM could accomplish in a satisfactory percentage a national people's unity within its ranks via all those institutions, while in the same time to impose its version of national unity from top to down through its participation to a government with all the other parties. Through these participations to an all-party government, it could a posteriori legitimize and consolidate those institutions as a part of a post-war political structure. So it was a combination of political unity on the top and social coalition on the basis. Finally, EAM and the Communist Party participated to a government of national unity just before the liberation of the country. But this unity proved to be impossible due to the divergence of social interests between the different classes of the Greek society and also the British policy. But until then, until the liberation, EAM had already won a vast popular support, nearly of the half of the country's population. As legitimacy through elections was not possible during the war, a descriptive vocabulary was applied by the resistance not only to describe, but also to change the political relations and the context of possible. In Greece, as we saw, the resistant institutions were described as that of popular democracy, laokratia, which was in the making, and that this laokratia was also the goal that went with the liberation of the country. But that was not only a Greek phenomenon. In all Europe, possibilities were open for a post-war reshapement of the political systems. For example, in France, we can find the notions of démocratie agissante and démocratie réelle, describing and legitimizing the decisions of the resistance, la résistance, by the will of the masses. It is interesting to see that while in Greece the two camps, that of EAM and that of the old party system, were antagonizing each other in order to gain the representation of the nation and construct their own version of national unity, in France the struggle was between the notion of résistance as the cornerstone of a new political legitimacy, according to the discourse of the French political Communist Party, and that of the continuation of the state, l'État, according to General de Gaulle. In conclusion, the resistance movement in Greece during occupation, under the influence of the Greek Communist Party, had a strategy to win the majority of the people and establish itself as a major political force in the country after the war. It followed the line of national unity in order to force other political parties to join the front, the National Liberation Front, or to form a united government. At the same time, it promoted laokratia as a rather vague form of a post-war regime. due to certain factors like the creation of free Greece, the liberated areas that needed government before the liberation of the country, and also of the growing hostility of the other parties and the British side towards EAM, the latter tried to diversify this national unity as unity within its ranks. So people, popular, and nation, national, were seen as one. The exclusion of social political forces from the people were presented as an exclusion from the body of the nation. This policy was successful in winning a massive popular support, but blurred the social divisions within this constructed people or nation. The impossibility of this unity was dramatically expressed in the subsequent civil war, when the left was eventually excluded from the political body and symbolically from the nation, with consequences for decades to come. Thank you.